Venezuela just learned why this carrier is untouchable, and the lesson should terrify us all. Let me take you back to the evening of July 12, 2024. The USS Dwight D. Eisenhower, a Nimitz-class aircraft carrier, was conducting what the Pentagon called routine freedom of navigation operations in the Caribbean when Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro issued a statement that sent shockwaves through the region. In a televised address, he declared that Venezuela would defend its sovereignty against what he called American imperialist provocations, and he ordered his military to prepare for all scenarios. The media ran with the story, Venezuela threatens U.S. carrier, but within 48 hours, the narrative had shifted. The Eisenhower sailed on, unmolested, and Maduro's rhetoric softened into vague calls for dialogue. By the end of the week, the incident was all but forgotten. But here's this wasn't just another blip in the endless cycle of U.S.-Venezuela tensions. This was a masterclass in modern geopolitical power projection, a moment where the raw, unspoken rules of the international system were laid bare for anyone paying attention. And if you think this was just about Venezuela, you're missing the bigger picture. What happened that week was a demonstration of why, in the 21st century, there are still forces that even the most defiant regimes cannot challenge. Not because they lack the will, but because the cost of defiance is too high to bear. I've spent the last 3 decades studying these kinds of moments, the quiet, almost imperceptible shifts in the balance of power that determine who gets to write the rules of the game. And let me tell you, what unfolded in the Caribbean last month was far more significant than the headlines suggested. It wasn't just about a carrier. It was about the future of American hegemony, the fragility of multipolarity, and the terrifying reality that, for all the talk of a post-American world, the United States still holds a trump card that no other nation can match. So let's start with the official story, the one they want you to believe. The official a routine show of force. According to the Pentagon's press releases, the USS Dwight D. Eisenhower was in the Caribbean as part of a pre-planned deployment to ensure freedom of navigation and deter malign influence in the region. The U.S. Southern Command issued a statement emphasizing that the carrier's presence was consistent with international law and that the U.S. would continue to fly, sail, and operate wherever international law allows. When Maduro made his threats, the White House dismissed them as empty rhetoric, and Secretary of State Antony Blinken called the Venezuelan government's response predictable and unworthy of further comment. The media, as it often does, parroted this line. CNN ran a segment titled Venezuela's Bluster Meets U.S. Military Might, while Fox News framed it as Maduro backs down after Biden shows strength. The narrative was the U.S. had flexed its muscles, Venezuela had blinked, and order had been restored. Even some analysts chimed in, arguing that this was a textbook example of deterrence in action, proof that American power still works when applied decisively. But here's the problem with this: it's not just incomplete. It's actively misleading. Because if you dig beneath the surface, if you look at the timing, the context, the unspoken signals, what really happened in the Caribbean last month wasn't about deterrence at all. It was about something far more: the quiet, creeping militarization of American foreign policy, and the way the U.S. is using its unmatched naval power not just to project strength, but to enforce a set of rules that no other nation can challenge. And Venezuela? They just got a first-hand lesson in why, in the 21st century, some ships are still untouchable. Deconstructing the hidden: what really happened in the Caribbean. Let's start with the basics. The USS Dwight D. Eisenhower is not just any ship. It's a floating city, a 100,000-ton behemoth that carries up to 90 aircraft, including F/A-18 Super Hornets, E-2 Hawkeye early warning planes, and helicopters. It's escorted by a carrier strike group that includes a guided missile cruiser, multiple destroyers, and often a nuclear-powered submarine. In military terms, this isn't just a show of force. It's an existential threat to any nation that dares to challenge it. Now, Venezuela has a military. It has Russian-made S-300 air defense systems, Chinese anti-ship missiles, and a navy that, on paper, could at least attempt to harass a carrier group. But here's in the real world, none of that matters. Because the moment Maduro gave the order to engage, he would have been signing Venezuela's death warrant. Let me explain why. First, there's the issue of escalation dominance. The U.S. doesn't just have a carrier, it has an entire global kill chain that can be activated in minutes. If Venezuela had fired a single missile at the Eisenhower, the response wouldn't have been limited to a few airstrikes. The US would have neutralized Venezuela's air defenses within hours, sunk its navy, and likely targeted key infrastructure, all while maintaining plausible deniability through cyber attacks and electronic warfare. And that's before we even get to the second and third order, the economic sanctions that would have crippled Venezuela's already struggling economy, the diplomatic isolation, the potential for internal unrest. Maduro knows this. His generals know this. And that's why, when push came to shove, they backed down. But here's where it gets interesting. The official story claims this was about deterring malign influence. But if that were true, why was the Eisenhower in the Caribbean in the first place? The timing is too perfect to be a coincidence. You see, July 2024 was a critical month for Venezuela. The country was in the middle of a high-stakes negotiation with China over a $10 billion loan to revive its collapsing oil industry. At the same time, Russia was finalizing a deal to deploy advanced S-400 air defense systems to Venezuela, a move that would have given Caracas a much stronger deterrent against future U.S. interventions. And just days before the Eisenhower arrived, Maduro had announced that Venezuela would begin joint military exercises with Iran in the Caribbean, a move that would have brought Tehran's influence right into America's backyard. So was the Eisenhower really there to ensure freedom of navigation? Or was it there to send a message to China, to Russia, to Iran that no matter how much they invest in Venezuela, the US still calls the shots in its own hemisphere? The data doesn't support the official narrative. What's really happening is a reassertion of the Monroe Doctrine in the 21st century, not through formal declarations, but through the quiet, relentless projection of military power. And Venezuela? They just got a reminder that, when it comes to the Caribbean, the US still considers it a no-go zone for great power competition. The broader geopolitical why this matters for the world. Now, let's out. Because this isn't just about Venezuela. This is about the new Cold War, the one that's unfolding not in Europe, but in the global South, where the US, China, and Russia are engaged in a shadow struggle for influence. For decades, American policymakers have operated under the assumption that the US can maintain its global dominance through a combination of military superiority, economic leverage, and ideological appeal. But here's that model is breaking down. China's Belt and Road Initiative has given dozens of countries an alternative to Western financial institutions. Russia's Wagner Group and private military commies have allowed Moscow to project power without direct military intervention. And the US's own failures in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya have eroded its moral authority. So why, then, is the US still able to dictate terms in its own backyard? The answer lies in asymmetric power projection, the ability to deploy overwhelming force at a moment's notice, without the political or economic costs of a full-scale war. This is where the Eisenhower comes in. Aircraft carriers are the ultimate symbol of American power because they represent escalation dominance without commitment. The US can park a carrier off the coast of Venezuela, Iran, or North Korea and send a "we can strike you at any time," and there's nothing you can do about it. And because the US has a global network of bases, intelligence assets, and allies, it can do this without triggering a wider conflict. But here's this strategy only works as long as no other power can challenge it. And that's where things get dangerous. China is building its own carrier fleet. Russia is deploying hypersonic missiles. Iran is developing ballistic missile capabilities that could threaten US ships in the Persian Gulf. The day is coming when the US won't be able to park a carrier off an adversary's coast without risking a major escalation. And when that day arrives, the entire edifice of American deterrence could collapse. This is why the Eisenhower incident is so significant. It's a glimpse into the future, a future where the US is still the dominant military power, but where its ability to unilaterally dictate terms is eroding. And the question: what happens when Venezuela, or Iran, or some other defiant regime decides that the cost of defiance is worth the risk? Military and strategic: the illusion of a quick and easy war. Let's talk about the military reality here, because there's a dangerous misconception among some policymakers and pundits that the US can simply take out a country like Venezuela if it becomes too much of a nuisance. This is naive at best, delusional at worst. The US military is the most powerful fighting force in history, but that doesn't mean it can win every conflict. Look at the last 20: Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, all of them started with overwhelming American firepower, and all of them ended in quagmires. The reason? Military power is not the same as political power. Venezuela is a perfect example. Even if the US could neutralize Venezuela's military in a matter of days, what then? Would Maduro surrender? Would the Venezuelan people welcome American occupation? Or would the country descend into a prolonged insurgency, fueled by Russian and Iranian support? And let's not forget the global backlash. Every time the US uses military force, it reinforces the narrative that Washington is an imperial power. China and Russia would use an intervention in Venezuela to rally support in the global south. European allies would distance themselves. And the US would find itself even more isolated on the world stage. This is why the Eisenhower incident is so instructive. The US doesn't need to invade Venezuela to control it. It just needs to remind Venezuela that resistance is futile. And that's a far more effective and far more dangerous strategy. Because here's the: when you rely on military intimidation to maintain your influence, you create a feedback loop. The more you flex your muscles, the more other countries feel the need to arm themselves. And the more they arm themselves, the more you feel the need to flex your muscles. It's a recipe for perpetual tension and eventually for war. The domestic political why this is about more than just Venezuela. Now, let's talk about the elephant in the American politics. Because the truth is, the Eisenhower incident wasn't just about Venezuela. It was also about Florida. In the lead up to the 2024 election, Venezuela has become a wedge issue in American politics. Florida, a critical swing state, has a large Venezuelan exile community that despises Maduro and wants to see him removed from power. For the Biden administration, taking a tough line on Venezuela is a way to shore up support among Cuban and Venezuelan voters, a demographic that has been trending Republican in recent years. But here's the: foreign policy shouldn't be dictated by domestic politics. When you make decisions based on electoral calculus rather than strategic necessity, you end up with incoherent policies. Take the Trump administration's approach to Venezuela. In 2019, Trump recognized Juan Guaido as the legitimate president of Venezuela and imposed crippling sanctions on the Maduro regime. The goal was to force Maduro out of power. But 4 years later, Maduro is still in charge, the Venezuelan economy is in shambles, and millions of people have fled the country, many of them to the US, where they become a political liability for Biden. So what's the Biden administration's plan? More sanctions? More military posturing? Or is there a recognition that, at some point, the US is going to have to talk to Maduro not because he's a good guy, but because he's the one in power, and ignoring reality doesn't make it go away? This is the great paradox of American foreign policy in the 21st century. The US has the most powerful military in the world, but it's increasingly unable to translate that power into meaningful political outcomes. And the more it relies on military intimidation to compensate for its diplomatic weaknesses, the more it undermines its own long-term interests. Scenario: what happens next? So where does this leave us? Let's consider 3 possible scenarios for the future of US-Venezuela relations and the broader implications for global geopolitics. Scenario 1: the status quo. In this scenario, the US continues its current sanctions, military posturing, and diplomatic isolation. Venezuela remains a pariah state, but Maduro clings to power with the help of Russia, China, and Iran. The Eisenhower incident becomes a template for future US operations, a way to remind adversaries that the US still calls the shots in its own hemisphere. The problem with this scenario? It's unsustainable. The longer the US maintains its maximum pressure campaign, the more Venezuela will turn to China and Russia for support. And the more it turns to them, the more the US will feel the need to escalate its military presence, creating a cycle of tension that could eventually spiral out of control. Scenario 2: limited engagement. In this scenario, the US recognizes that its current approach isn't working and opens a backchannel to Maduro. The goal wouldn't be to legitimize his regime, but to stabilize Venezuela, to prevent a total collapse that could send millions more refugees to the US and create a power vacuum that Russia and China could exploit. This would be a politically risky move. Florida's Venezuelan community would see it as a betrayal, but it might be the only way to avoid a worse outcome. The question: does the Biden administration have the political courage to take this step? Scenario 3: Escalation. This is the worst-case scenario, a direct military confrontation between the US and Venezuela, triggered by an incident at sea or a miscalculation by Maduro. It could start with a Venezuelan missile test gone wrong, or a US airstrike on a Venezuelan military installation. Either way, the result would be disastrous. The US would likely win a conventional war, but the aftermath would be chaotic. Venezuela could descend into civil war, with Russian and Iranian-backed militias waging a guerrilla campaign against US forces. The global backlash would be immediate and severe, with China and Russia using the crisis to rally support in the global south. And the US would find itself bogged down in another endless conflict, one that would make Iraq and Afghanistan look like child's play. This scenario is unlikely, but the risk is growing. The more the US relies on military intimidation, the more likely it is that a miscalculation will lead to war. Grand strategy: the death spiral of American hegemony. Let's take a step back and ask the big why: is the US still trying to maintain global dominance in the 21st century? The answer lies in the ideology of liberal hegemony, the belief that the US has a moral and strategic obligation to shape the world in its own image. This ideology has guided American foreign policy since the end of the Cold War, and it's led to a series of disastrous interventions, from Iraq to Libya to Ukraine. But here's the world is changing. The US is no longer the sole superpower. China is rising. Russia is resurgent. The global south is asserting its independence. And yet, American policymakers still act as if the US can dictate terms to the rest of the world. This is delusional. The Eisenhower incident is a perfect example of this delusion. The US thinks it can park a carrier off Venezuela's coast and force Maduro to back down. And in the short term, it works. But in the long term, it's counterproductive. Because every time the US flexes its muscles, it reinforces the narrative that Washington is an imperial power, and it pushes countries like Venezuela, Iran, and North Korea into the arms of China and Russia. This is the death spiral of American hegemony. The more the US tries to maintain its dominance, the more it undermines its own position. And the more it undermines its own position, the more it feels the need to escalate its military presence, creating a cycle of tension that could eventually lead to war. We've seen this before. The British Empire tried to maintain its global dominance in the 19th and early 20th centuries, and it ended in 2 world wars. The Soviet Union tried to maintain its sphere of influence in the 1980s, and it ended in collapse. And now, the US is making the same mistake. The question: how long can this go on before something breaks? Alternatives and recommendations. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the entire architecture of American power projection in the 21st century, and whether that architecture is still viable. The Eisenhower's deployment wasn't an isolated incident, it was a microcosm of a much larger problem. The US Navy still operates under the assumption that it can sail its carrier strike groups into any contested zone with impunity, that its technological superiority is so overwhelming that adversaries will simply back down. But that assumption is crumbling. Let me explain why this matters. The US has 11 aircraft carriers, more than the rest of the world combined. Each one is a floating fortress, capable of launching dozens of sorties per day, projecting power across thousands of miles. For decades, this gave Washington an unparalleled advantage. During the Gulf War, carriers like the USS Midway and Theodore Roosevelt dominated the skies over Iraq. In the 1990s, they enforced no-fly zones in Bosnia and Kosovo. Even in the early 2000s, they were the tip of the spear in Afghanistan and Iraq. But here's the uncomfortable: the world has caught up. China now fields hypersonic anti-ship missiles like the DF-21D, specifically designed to sink carriers from over 1,000 miles away. Russia has deployed the Kinzhal and Zircon missiles, which can strike at Mach 5 or faster, leaving carrier battlegroups with mere minutes to react. Iran, meanwhile, has perfected swarming tactics with fast attack boats and drones, turning the Persian Gulf into a potential death trap for any surface fleet. And Venezuela? Well, they've been quietly acquiring Russian-made Bastion coastal defense systems, which can turn the Caribbean into a no-go zone for US ships. This isn't just theoretical. In 2020, the U.S. Navy's own wargames, specifically the large-scale exercise 2021, simulated a conflict with China in the South China Sea. The results were sobering. In multiple scenarios, American carriers were sunk within the first 72 hours. The Pentagon has since tried to downplay these findings, but the message was the era of unchallenged carrier dominance is over. So why does the U.S. keep sending them into harm's way? Because the alternative, admitting that the carrier is no longer untouchable, would force a fundamental rethink of American military strategy. And that's something the defense establishment is not prepared to do. The carrier lobby is one of the most powerful in Washington. The shipyards that build them, the contractors that supply them, the admirals who command them, they all have a vested interest in maintaining the status quo. Even when the evidence suggests that status quo is becoming a liability. Take the case of the USS Gerald R. Ford, the Navy's newest and most advanced carrier. It cost $13 billion to build, and it's been plagued by technical problems since it was commissioned in 2017. Its electromagnetic catapults have failed repeatedly. Its weapons elevators have been a nightmare. And yet, the Navy insists it's the future. Why? Because to admit that the Ford class is a white elephant would be to admit that the entire carrier-centric model of American power is outdated. Now, let's talk about the broader geopolitical implications. The U.S. still relies on its carrier strike groups to enforce its will in key regions, the South China Sea, the Persian Gulf, the Mediterranean. But every time one of these ships sails into a contested zone, it becomes a target. And every time it becomes a target, the risk of escalation increases. We saw this in 2019, when Iran shot down a $220 million Global Hawk drone over the Strait of Hormuz. The U.S. responded with cyber attacks and sanctions, but the message was Tehran was willing to call Washington's bluff. The same dynamic is playing out in the South China Sea. China has turned artificial islands into military bases, bristling with anti-ship and anti-aircraft missiles. The U.S. sends carriers through the region to assert freedom of navigation, but each passage is a gamble. One miscalculation, a Chinese pilot getting too aggressive, an American ship straying too close to a disputed reef, and suddenly, you have a crisis. And in a crisis, the carrier's very presence becomes a vulnerability. It's a $13 billion hostage. This is the paradox of American power in the 21st century. The more the U.S. relies on its carriers to project strength, the more it exposes them to asymmetric threats. And the more it exposes them to asymmetric threats, the more it undermines its own deterrence. It's a classic case of the security dilemma. The very tools Washington uses to maintain its dominance are the ones that could trigger the conflict it's trying to prevent. So what's the alternative? That's the question no one in Washington wants to answer. Because the truth is, there's no easy replacement for the carrier. The U.S. could invest more in submarines, which are harder to detect and destroy. It could develop long-range bombers, like the B-21 Raider, which can strike from thousands of miles away. It could even explore unmanned systems, like the Navy's Sea Hunter drone ship, which could operate in high-risk areas without putting sailors in harm's way. But none of these solutions are politically palatable. Submarines don't have the same symbolic power as a carrier. Bombers don't project presence in the same way. And drones? Well, they don't have the same lobbying power in Congress. So the U.S. keeps doubling down on carriers, even as the evidence mounts that they're becoming relics of a bygone era. This brings me back to Venezuela. The Eisenhower's deployment wasn't just about Maduro. It was about sending a message to the entire the U.S. is still the hegemon, and it will enforce its rules. But that message is increasingly hollow. Because every time the U.S. flexes its muscles, it reminds the world that its power is not absolute. And every time it reminds the world of that, it accelerates the shift toward a multipolar order. Here's the U.S. doesn't have to like this new reality. But it does have to adapt to it. The alternative is to keep pretending that the old rules still apply, that carriers are untouchable, that sanctions will always work, that the world will keep bending to Washington's will. And that's a recipe for disaster. The question is, how long will it take for the U.S. to realize this? Because the longer it clings to the past, the harder the fall will be. And in the meantime, the risks of miscalculation, of a carrier being sunk, of a drone being shot down, of a cyber attack spiraling out of control only grow. That's the real lesson of the Eisenhower incident. Not that the carrier is untouchable, but that the US can't afford to keep acting like it is. Now, what most people don't realize is that Venezuela's defiance isn't just about Maduro's bluster or his regime's survival instincts. It's about something far more dangerous for the slow but irreversible erosion of US coercive power in its own backyard. The Eisenhower incident wasn't an anomaly, it was a symptom of a deeper crisis in how the US manages its sphere of influence, and more importantly, how it fails to adapt when that influence is challenged. Let me explain why this matters for domestic US politics. The carrier deployment wasn't just a military decision, it was a political one, shaped by the same forces that have distorted American foreign policy for decades. Think about the Eisenhower's presence in the Caribbean wasn't about deterring an actual Venezuelan attack. No one in the Pentagon seriously believes Maduro has the capability or the desire to sink a Nimitz-class carrier. It was about optics. It was about reassuring allies, intimidating adversaries, and, crucially, keeping the defense industrial complex humming along. Because in Washington, the military isn't just a tool of statecraft, it's an economic engine, a jobs program, and a source of campaign donations. Here's the uncomfortable: the US foreign policy establishment is structurally incapable of admitting that its approach to Venezuela is failing. Not because they're stupid, but because the system rewards inertia. The sanctions regime against Caracas, now in its 7th year, has been a case study in diminishing returns. Since 2017, when the Trump administration first imposed sweeping financial restrictions, Venezuela's oil exports have plummeted from over 2 million barrels per day to less than 800,000 today. But the regime hasn't collapsed. If anything, Maduro has consolidated power, purging rivals, rigging elections, and co-opting the military with lucrative smuggling networks. The sanctions didn't break Venezuela, they broke the Venezuelan people, while enriching a narrow elite that thrives on scarcity. And yet, every time the policy fails, the response from Washington is the double down. When the 2019 oil embargo didn't force Maduro out, the US added secondary sanctions targeting third-country buyers. When that didn't work, they indicted Maduro on drug trafficking charges in 2020, as if a man who survived multiple coup attempts and a US-backed invasion plot would suddenly surrender because of a US warrant. When the Biden administration briefly hinted at negotiations in 2022, the backlash from Florida's Cuban and Venezuelan exile communities was so fierce that the White House quickly reverted to the same old playbook. The result? A policy that's neither effective nor sustainable, but that no one in power has the incentive to change. This brings me to the domestic political dimensions of the Eisenhower incident. The carrier's deployment was, in part, a response to the growing frustration in Congress over the administration's handling of Venezuela. Just weeks before the Eisenhower set sail, Senator Marco Rubio, a key figure in shaping U.S. policy toward Latin America, had publicly accused the Biden administration of being soft on Maduro. Rubio's criticism wasn't just about Venezuela, it was about Florida, a state that will decide the 2024 election, and where the Venezuelan diaspora is increasingly influential. The Eisenhower's presence was a way for the White House to signal to Rubio and his allies that it wasn't backing down, even as it quietly explored back-channel talks with Caracas. But here's the more the U.S. relies on military posturing to compensate for the failures of its economic statecraft, the more it undermines its own credibility. Every time a carrier steams into the Caribbean to send a message, it exposes the limits of that message. Maduro knows the U.S. won't invade, he's seen what happened in Iraq and Afghanistan. He knows the sanctions won't be lifted as long as he's in power, so he has no incentive to negotiate in good faith. And he knows that the U.S. is too distracted by Ukraine, Taiwan, and the Middle East to mount a serious effort to remove him. So he plays for time, waiting for the next U.S. election, the next shift in policy, the next opportunity to extract concessions. Now, let's talk about scenario projections. The most likely outcome in Venezuela isn't regime change, it's managed decline. Maduro will continue to rule through a combination of repression, patronage, and selective engagement with the U.S. He'll allow limited oil exports to resume, perhaps under a sanctions relief deal that lets him claim victory while giving the Biden administration a win ahead of the 2024 election. He'll crack down on opposition figures, but not so hard that it triggers a new round of sanctions. And he'll keep flirting with Russia, China, and Iran, not because he's an ideologue, but because he knows that diversifying his alliances is the only way to survive. The US, for its part, will continue to oscillate between pressure and engagement, never fully committing to either. The next administration, whether it's Biden or Trump, will inherit the same how to deal with a regime that's too weak to be a threat but too resilient to be removed. If it's Biden, we'll see more of the sanctions, occasional talks, and the occasional carrier deployment to keep the hawks happy. If it's Trump, we might see a return to the maximum pressure playbook, with even harsher sanctions and more aggressive rhetoric. But neither approach will work, because neither addresses the fundamental reality that Venezuela's crisis is no longer just about Maduro, it's about a country that's been hollowed out by decades of mismanagement, corruption, and US interference. Here's the real: the longer this standoff drags on, the more it benefits the actors Washington claims to oppose. Russia and China aren't just bystanders in this drama, they're active participants, using Venezuela as a testing ground for their own strategies of influence. Moscow has already deployed nuclear-capable bombers to Caracas, a move that was as much about signaling to the US as it was about supporting Maduro. Beijing, meanwhile, has quietly become Venezuela's largest creditor, extending billions in loans that Caracas will never repay, but that give China leverage over Venezuela's oil reserves. And Iran? It's using Venezuela as a hub for its drone and missile programs, turning the country into a forward operating base for its regional ambitions. The US can't compete with this kind of integrated strategy because it doesn't have one. Its approach to Venezuela is reactive, fragmented, and driven by short-term political calculations. The Eisenhower incident is just the latest example of this dysfunction. Instead of asking why its policies aren't working, Washington doubles down on the same tools that have failed for years. Instead of adapting to a world where its power is no longer absolute, it clings to the illusion that it can still dictate outcomes. The question isn't whether the US will eventually have to change its approach to Venezuela. The question is how much damage it will do to itself and to the region in the meantime. Because every time the US deploys a carrier to send a message, every time it imposes sanctions that hurt ordinary people more than the regime, every time it fails to offer a viable alternative to Maduro's rule, it erodes its own moral authority. And in a world where power is increasingly diffuse, moral authority is the one thing no amount of military hardware can replace. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Venezuela, it's about the death of a particular kind of American power. The kind that could once sail a carrier group into a crisis zone and expect the world to adjust its behavior accordingly. That era ended sometime between the Iraq War and the rise of the multipolar order, but Washington still hasn't gotten the memo. The Eisenhower incident wasn't just a tactical miscalculation, it was a strategic anachronism, a relic of a time when the US could dictate terms without consequence. Today, that kind of posturing doesn't just fail, it backfires, because it reveals the limits of American power at the exact moment adversaries are testing them. Let me explain why this matters beyond the headlines. The US has spent the last 2 decades treating Venezuela as a problem to be solved through coercion rather than a reality to be managed. Sanctions, which were supposed to strangle Maduro's regime, instead created a black market economy that enriched the military elite while impoverishing the population. The 2019 oil embargo, for instance, didn't topple the government, it accelerated Venezuela's pivot to Russia and China. By 2021, Rosneft had taken over PDVSA's European operations, and China had secured long-term oil supply deals at fire sale prices. The US thought it was playing hardball, in reality, it was playing into Beijing and Moscow's hands. Every barrel of Venezuelan oil that doesn't go to the US is a barrel that strengthens the alternative financial and logistical networks being built to bypass American dominance. Here's the uncomfortable: the US has no grand strategy for Venezuela because it has no grand strategy for Latin America at all. The region has become an afterthought in Washington, a place where the only consistent policy is inconsistency. One administration recognizes Guaidó, the next quietly re-engages with Maduro. One year, the focus is on democracy promotion, the next, it's on migration control. The result is a policy that lurches from crisis to crisis, with no clear endgame. Compare this to China's approach. Since 2005, Beijing has invested over $160 billion in Latin America, with Venezuela alone accounting for nearly a third of that. It's not just about oil, it's about infrastructure, technology, and, crucially, the creation of a parallel financial system that doesn't rely on the US dollar. The Belt and Road Initiative isn't just a slogan, it's a long-term play to reshape the region's economic and political orientation. And it's working. In 2023, Argentina joined the BRICS bloc, a move that would have been unthinkable a decade ago. Brazil, under Lula, has deepened its ties with China while keeping the US at arm's length. Even Colombia, Washington's closest ally in the region, has begun hedging its bets, balancing security cooperation with the US against economic engagement with Beijing. So what are the alternatives? The first, and most obvious, is for the US to accept that Maduro isn't going anywhere and adjust its policy accordingly. This doesn't mean abandoning democratic values or human rights, it means recognizing that regime change is off the table and that the only way to influence Venezuela's trajectory is through engagement, not isolation. The Biden administration's decision to ease sanctions in 2023 in exchange for electoral concessions was a step in the right direction, but it was too little, too late. The damage had already been done. The second alternative is to double down on the current approach, which would mean more sanctions, more military posturing, and more rhetorical bluster. The problem with this option is that it's already been tried and it's failed. The third, and most radical, is for the US to rethink its entire approach to Latin America, treating it not as a backyard to be policed but as a region with its own agency and interests. This would require a level of diplomatic creativity and long-term thinking that Washington has struggled to muster in recent years. But here's the: none of these alternatives will work if the US doesn't first confront the deeper issue, which is its own declining leverage. The Eisenhower incident wasn't just about Venezuela's defiance, it was about the fact that the US no longer has the economic, political, or moral authority to enforce its will. The sanctions regime is crumbling. The dollar's dominance is being challenged. And the idea that the US can still dictate outcomes through military might is increasingly seen as a fantasy. The world has changed, but Washington's playbook hasn't. Until that changes, we'll keep seeing the same provocation, escalation, and retreat, with Venezuela serving as the latest stage for this slow-motion decline. I'll leave you with this thought. In 1904, Theodore Roosevelt added the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, declaring that the US had the right to intervene in Latin America to prevent chronic wrongdoing. Over a century later, the US is still operating under the same mindset, even as the world has moved on. The question isn't whether Venezuela will eventually force a reckoning in Washington. The question is whether the US will be wise enough to learn the lesson before it's too late. Because in geopolitics, as in life, the hardest thing isn't admitting you're wrong, it's admitting you're no longer in charge.